It's titled The Backlash Against Testing. I would like to propose that we broaden it a little bit and we talk about the politics of testing, which came up all throughout the day because we must think beyond the backlash to moving forward with the, I'll for shorthand say, Gordon Commission vision and how that happens politically. So that's the subject of the afternoon. What's the practical, real-world political surround in which our hopes for better assessment have to acknowledge? I'm going to break with tradition here and not read the whole bios of everybody, which are in your program booklet, but I'll just briefly introduce the panelists today. We have Jeffrey Henig, Professor of Political Science and Education here at TC, and also the chair of our Education Policy and Social Analysis Department. And following him, a little bit out of order of the program, Sharon Lynn Kagan. Lynn is the Virginia and Leonard Marks Professor of Early Childhood and Family Policy and co-director of the National Center for Children and Families here at TC, and adjunct professor at the Yale University Child Study Center. And then Kevin Dougherty, who's associate professor in EPSA in the same department and also in the organization leadership department, and senior research associate at the Community College Research Center here at TC. And moving away from TC, we then have Mehta, an associate professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, whose research is on understanding what it would take to create high-quality schooling at scale, with a particular interest in the personalization of teaching.
Professionalization.
Professionalization. I am sorry. Personalization is on my mind when I think about testing. To that, too. And Frederick, or Rick Hess, an educator, political scientist, and author at the American Enterprise Institute, who studies K-12 and higher education issues. We're going to begin with a 5-minute opening remark from each of the panelists and then engage in a moderated discussion, and we'll be sure to leave time for your participation in that discussion later in the program. So, Jeff?
Thanks, sure. So I should point out, too, the TC Mafia part of this presentation is coming at our initial conversation, at least from standpoint of different levels of the early childhood to higher ed system. EPSA, Department of Education Policy and Social Analysis, one of the things that we're trying to attend to is the fact that debates at these different levels are often very disconnected, even though there are issues like testing and assessment that cut across them. I'm opening up with some points about K-12, which, in light of the earlier session, kind of taps in more directly with some of this discussion this morning. There are, a number of faces to the reaction against testing at the K-12 level. It includes the so-called soccer moms who was referenced this morning. Secretary of Education Arne Duncan characterized as all of a sudden their children aren't as brilliant as they thought they were and their school isn't quite as good as they thought they were, and that's pretty scary. It also includes in large cities, including New York, what New York Magazine recently referred to as the opt-outers, people who are either actually or potentially talking about holding their kids out from the testing in the city schools out of concern about the impact of standardized testing on their children's educational experience. In one school, Earth School in the East Village, reportedly last spring, a third of the parents held their kids out of the testing. It includes teachers, for example, those in New York and LA who were incensed when test-based scores of their value added were publicly reported in local newspapers, or those in Syracuse, New York, where the superintendent reported in October that in the latest round of testing, not a single elementary or middle school teacher in this entire district was rated as highly effective. It includes governors in largely, but not exclusively, Republican and more conservative states, some of whom are stepping away from implementing Common Core standards and testing, expressing concerns about federal intrusion. And it includes Tea Party and other small government anti-tax groups that see testing not only as too costly in itself, but as being part of a process that they believe in which low scores are used to justify higher government expenditures. So in my opening remarks, I just want to limit myself to two key points about how this reaction is commonly misunderstood and how that misunderstanding may fog our assessment about what's likely to happen. So first, if a movement is a broad phenomenon marked by people and groups banding together because of shared goals and perspectives, then the anti-testing movement is not really a movement at all. It's a coalition of strange bedfellows, disparate groups, linked by association and by dissatisfaction with the direction of contemporary education reform, but with very different core goals and values. So some of these groups, some I referenced already, are reacting to what they see as a dumbing down associated with standardized testing, but they're deeply committed to high-quality public education, and if anything, would like to see more investment and more attention to those. There's others who are reacting against what they see, and this was talked about a little bit this morning, as the combined and growing role of big government on the one hand and big business represented by testing and assessment industry on the other, and want to return to an era of more locally determined, community-based education. Some are, acting out ideological and partisan strategies of one kind or another. For example, some rallying their troops by drawing parallels between Common Core and federal health care, labeling the current White House approach to testing and standards as Obama Core. And some seeing an effort to use testing to discredit public education and pave the way for more privatized system based on vouchers. So recognizing this is important because while these groups share a distaste for what is, they're miles apart in terms of their vision of what ought to be. I'll come back to that in a second. Second point is not only is this not properly understood as an anti-testing movement, I'd say it's also not properly, as an anti-testing movement, it's also not properly understood as anti-testing. Although it's often expressed that way. As was emphasized by both of the panels this morning, tests are instruments. They can take very different forms. They can be designed for very different purposes. They can be designed well or badly. They can be used as intended, or they can be misapplied. It's possible to imagine someone being for or against testing in general. But in reality, almost everyone who's active in this debate is reacting against a particular form of a test embedded in a particular application. And to understand the current backlash, I think it's critical to distinguish testing per se with testing as it's embedded in a particular accountability regime. Now, very quickly, by accountability regime, I mean the formal laws and regulations as well as the informal practices that determine such things as whether and how tests are used for informing instruction, for helping to diagnose problems, for steering efforts at remediation, or whether and how they may be used to target extra support or allocate sanctions, and whether those sanctions, both rewards and punishments, are applied automatically by statistical algorithms or being part of information that informs democratic judgment. By accountability regime, I also mean whether tests are used as part of an internal decision-making and policy-making process or made publicly available. And finally, accountability regime also relates to who makes the decisions about these things. Is it done locally or at a higher and more distant level of government? If it's done by elected, is it done by elected officials or education specialists? And if education specialists, those working with public bureaucracies, or within private organizations. These are the elements of an accountability regime, and with little exception, I'd suggest that what the various groups commonly characterize as being anti-testing are really reacting against is a particular accountability regime that they see emerging on the contemporary education landscape. Testing as a technical matter has been getting better, but the accountability regimes around testing have changed in ways that leave different groups unhappy for different reasons. There's a movement away, they see a movement away from local control and local values, a decline of influence of those they believe more closely represented them or whom they trust more to act in their interest, a shift from rewards and investment towards sanctions and perhaps towards cost shaving. This, and this will be my final point, this makes for a wildly unpredictable political context in which redirection could take any of a number of different forms, depending on combinations of groups as they lie around specific issues, and could very well have an outcome in which at least some of the groups involved are even more dissatisfied with the results of the anti-testing movement than they are with the accountability regime that they're facing today. And maybe I'll get a chance to elaborate on those in our discussion.
Let me do next one. Great. Hi, everybody, and a very special welcome to my graduate students. Thank you for coming. You're the people to whom we are almost accountable. I've been asked today to talk about testing and assessment through the lens of early childhood, and I titled my comments, "The Proverbial Paradox in Early Childhood Education." What it really is a story of semantics, of politics, and of heretics. So let's start off with the semantics. You know, often the terms testing and assessment are used quite synonymously in educational parlance, but in early childhood education, which I define as those services that cover children birth to age 8, these two words are very different and they mean different things. If you look at any teacher preparation book from the beginning when early childhood became a field, you would always note that early childhood educators were asked to be very keen observers of young children's behavior. Indeed, in those old books, and even in my old lifetime, we all wore smocks with big pockets because in addition to carrying Kleenex in our pocket to wipe runny noses, we carried index cards to chronicle children's behavior. Those observations were then used in the planning of appropriate pedagogical and learning activities for these very visible, these very quick learners. So we performed assessments on an ongoing basis, and indeed they were the very bedrock of early childhood education. Today, the world's most noted early childhood program, the Reggio Emilia approach to early education, builds its reputation on ongoing documentation and discussion of observing children's behavior, on assessment. By contrast, testing is a loathsome word in early childhood, and it's even a more loathsome concept. Because young children's learning is so episodic, because it demands so much repetition, because of the inadequacy of tests for young children, some would contend that testing young children is absolutely immoral, if not verboten. So indeed, the mantra, at least the semantic mantra, is assessment, yes, testing, a almost bellicose no. Let's turn to politics. Enter Race to the Top and enter Baby Race to the Top, which is Race to the Top for very, very young children, and we can see that assessment is really coming to the fore, as is testing in early childhood. And as it has grown, so has the response against it. We have an early childhood alliance made up of cascades of organizations which have taken positions. They've been to Congress. They've talked to the Business Roundtable, to the NGA, about how loathsome and how inappropriate testing is for very, very young children. They are against formal testing because indeed they feel that this will accelerate, heaven forbid, schoolification and decelerate what early childhood holds most dear, notably a holistic approach to early education. When you layer on accountability, as Jeff says, the din is even worse. Remember that early childhood education lacks an infrastructure, it lacks a durable funding stream, it lacks a durable governance structure. Indeed, it doesn't really look at all like K-12, to which all of those properties are attendant. In reality, early childhood then is being asked to hold children accountable as an output when indeed the inputs are not at all comparable to what even is parallel to regular K-12 education. Indeed, despite this, there are a very large number of states, about 45 to be exact, that are currently involved with government inducement in developing kindergarten entry assessments, the one time when we really can capture what is happening in the development of all children. These efforts are both promising and perplexing. They are really trying to collect information on all domains of development, physical development, social development, and indeed, they are causing real havoc in the field. Let me move to the heretical part of my conversation. I am not reflective of the mainstream of early childhood educators, as our students will tell you. I think inevitably testing, and I do mean testing, not assessment, will seep its way into the early childhood arena, making the expenditure of energy to ward off its inevitability somewhat wasteful. Rather, I think early childhood leaders should be fostering the development and the appropriate use of effective assessments for young children. Because, and we've seen this over and over again in our nation's Head Start program, when assessments are indeed used artfully, they can boost the notoriously poor quality of a large number of early childhood programs. Indeed, to the degree that early childhood education makes a big difference in the life of children, I believe that testing can call to the fore because it will evoke concrete data, the attention of policymakers to increase the accordance as well as the resources to early childhood. So where am I? I am bring on testing, but be sure you do it very, very well, respecting all domains and the very precious nature of development that accompanies the very young child.
Thank you. Kevin.
Thank you. So I find myself in discussing higher education is so often the case that it's often taking, having to say, but it's different. What we're finding in higher education is that the accountability regime, let me borrow Jeff's term, is considerably different in its content, considerably more scattered, and as a result, any kind of criticism and even backlash is much less developed than is the case that we're seeing and what Lynn has described in early childhood and Jeff in K through 12. Maybe just to give you a bit of a sketch, it's good to begin thinking about what accountability looks like in higher education because it is rather different from what we're used to from K through 12. We don't have anything that really looks like, for example, No Child Left Behind. The closest that would come to it would be the performance funding programs that about 24 states now have, another 4 states have coming on. And these programs take, what they're doing is that they're premising some of the funding that institutions are getting from the state on performance indicators. Very typically, it would be something like graduation number or rate, credit progression, perhaps developmental education completion. But what is notable is only a few states have learning outcomes assessment as part of their performance funding regime. So anything that's really close to No Child Left Behind, we don't have that present. There are other areas within higher education where you're beginning to see something that might seem a little closer to what we're seeing in K through 12 early childhood. The spread of the collegiate learning assessment and other forms of learning outcomes assessment, that comes a little closer. Several states have adopted it or mandated it. Several major university systems have done it. So that is spreading and is now encompasses, I think, over 300 institutions. We're also seeing the beginnings of something, another development is rather interesting of the use of prior learning or competency testing, where a number of states are beginning to explore the idea of having students waived from having to take courses if they can prove that they have the necessary competences, and they're even thinking of an entire degrees can be done on this basis. Some institutions have already been doing it. States are now thinking of doing it in a much broader way. And I can get into a little later as to what are the forces driving these developments. But let's talk a little bit about the response. I would say to begin with, and then let me try to give you a little bit of detail, is that the criticism within higher education, or let's say the higher education policy realm or policy subsystem, is considerably more muted and scattered than what we're seeing within K through 12 or within early childhood. It's really hard to talk about a backlash because the various areas are so scattered, and part of it is some of these developments are so new and so incompletely institutionalized that it's hard to think about them being established well enough to provoke a kind of a backlash. To the degree there's criticism, the critiques are a mixture of a lot, what Jeff was saying, primarily critiques of the form testing or accountabilities taking, less to testing and accountability in general, though there are elements of that as well. But it's a little hard to characterize, again, because of this very scattered nature of what we're talking about. Let me give you a quick sense. Performance funding now encompasses half of all states, but there's been surprisingly little criticism of it. There are the beginnings of some sort of concerted critique. There was just recently an explosion of comments within Inside Higher Education over a recent paper that concluded that performance funding is not having any significant impacts on student outcomes. And there's already some considerable debate over that. But for the most part, there has not been any real concerted criticism. There's a lot of criticism over placement testing in community colleges. Are they using the right measures to determine who should go under developmental education? But it's been more a critique of the instruments used than the notion of testing per se. You, of course, are probably familiar with the critique that, or the criticism that occurred over the collegiate learning assessment, and particularly the findings by Aram and Roxa, that a large proportion of students were not evidencing any major improvement in significant improvement in their critical learning skills. And there was an explosion of comments over the methodological and other characteristics of their study and of the CLA and whether or not it's an appropriate measure. So there's certainly that, but then that's been localized to those particular measures. There's certainly concern about competency testing, faculty being concerned about whether it adequately captures what goes on in the classroom. So there's criticism. It's hard to call it backlash. It's not sufficiently, I think, unified and clear, and its terms are really hard to characterize. I think what it's safe to say, and I'll follow this up in further remarks, is that it is quite likely that these accountability regimes in higher education will continue to spread. There's no reason to think the performance funding is going to be receding. The CLA and other devices are going to continue to spread. Inevitably, there are going to be reactions to this. I think at the same time, there's some very powerful countervailing forces that may prevent higher education from beginning to look very much like K through 12. Time will tell. But it's embedded in a very different policy subsystem than K through 12. It's seen in very different ways, and it'll be hard to say whether we'll be seeing exactly in higher education the kinds of backlash that we've seen in K through 12. And I can follow this up in our further remarks.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. All right, so I want to use one of my 5 minutes to invite you to ponder a question. How many people were here this morning? Okay, so this morning we were treated to some of the findings of the Gordon Commission, which was briefly laid out as a vision focused on formative rather than summative assessments, or at least a greater emphasis on formative along with summative assessments, with a much wider array of things that we could measure, potentially the use of sampled tests, and ultimately, in a really nice phrase, assessment for rather than of education. So my question is, why don't we do that? Not like, why don't we do that going forward, but why haven't we done that over the last 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years? So I'll
answer?
I do have an answer. So we can talk about, I'd be interested to hear your answers in the response. If I had more than 5 minutes, I would take them now. But, there's some obvious reasons. They're more expensive. They seem, though not necessarily are, more subjective. But I think one of the central things is the vision laid out by the Gordon Commission envisions a kind of partnership between the profession, the teachers, the people working on the ground, the policymakers, and the assessment community. And that partnership hasn't been there. And that's why, in a really short version, why the kinds of ways in which policymakers have chosen to use tests is that they're essentially trying to solve a good number of educational problems using a rather blunt instrument. So we took a little bit of historical perspective. You could say that if you look at our schools over the last 30 or 40 years, we have increasing segregation. We have a weak welfare state compared to other countries. We have more options for talented women other than teaching. And now we have rising expectations for schools driven by economic rationales and by civil rights rationales. So in that kind of situation, policymakers look out at the landscape. They see schools that either are or they perceive to be failing, and in some cases really are struggling. If we looked at, if we went back 10 or 15 years, we'd have 40 or 50% of kids dropping out of school in major urban centers. And that leads for the use of tests not as a tool to help and support, but tests as a tool to prod and hold accountable. And so what's essentially happened is that the kind of accountability wing of the standards movement sort of took over from the standards movement, which is a perfectly sensible idea, which is that if you wanted to increase the performance of schools, you should have some sense of what it is they were trying to accomplish and that those standards should be raised over time. It seems like the challenge going forward is to get out of this kind of overweighting on someone of accountability and build a kind of a system. So people often ask me, are you for or against No Child Left Behind? Are you for or against Common Core? From my point of view, those things will not rise or fall necessarily entirely on their psychometric properties, but rather on the system in which they're embedded. So No Child Left Behind was embedded in a system where there's very little practice-relevant knowledge distributed to teachers. There's teacher training, which by teachers' own account, for the most part, does not prepare them well. And then they work in schools where they don't have time or internal processes to examine work together, lesson study, all that good stuff. And so in that kind of a situation, we are trying to put, again, as I said before, on the tests a weight that they were never really intended to bear. I think in general, professions face a choice between self-regulation and external regulation. Self-regulation and external regulation. And so higher ed historically has been a sphere where, for the most part, people have seen professors as people who have some degree of knowledge about the topics about which they're talking, which I know that Rick has quite some skepticism about, but we're at a university today, so perhaps we can take that as a given. And because of that, the thought that someone on sort of Beacon Hill could tell someone at a university in Cambridge exactly what they should teach or exactly how they should be measured would be viewed as sort of offensive or disrespectful. We don't really have that sense with respect to K-12. Now, higher ed has many failings of its own, detailed in the Aram and Raska book, and higher ed, for the most part, has rested for a long time on its reputation, and that time may be coming to an end, and Kevin's work is starting to point to the ways in which it's coming to an end. And so what higher ed needs to do is get out in front of that movement, create some assessments, which I presume would be more along the lines of what was presented by the Gordon Commission this morning, that were nuanced, that were carefully developed in ways that matched rather than were contrary to the purposes of the institution. I just want to put one more thing on the table, which is a model. So I think one way to think about what happened with No Child Left Behind is at the beginning, the critics were all on the edges. Like people on the left, like Paul Wellstone said, you want to do this, but you're not funding it. Other people on the left said it's too standardized in education. And people on the right said it's a state takeover and that sort of thing. But the people in the middle, George W. Bush, Ted Kennedy, George Miller, John Boehner, passed the thing, and there was a lot of support from the center. And then over time, it didn't live up to its promise. It had set a bar which it couldn't meet, and then newspaper editors, teachers, parents, all those people in the middle gradually soured on it. And I think Common Core right now, we can see the edges, though the edges are larger this time because it just happened with No Child Left Behind. And unless the people who are in favor of Common Core build all that good stuff that would make Common Core assessments of reality, the same thing's going to happen, except probably twice as fast.
Yeah. Rick?
So, the trick with going after 4 smart people is I don't actually have anything particularly to say that hasn't been said, which is actually often the case when I think of it. So let me just try to put a couple of lenses around ideas we put on the table. First, I think Giles right that anybody in an academic setting would take offense if legislators were trying to minutely prescribe scope and sequence or pedagogy. On the other hand, you guys live in New York. The mayor has just made it clear, for instance, a newly elected mayor, that he wants to see changes in policy regarding how the police go about their business. What police officers may not like this, but it's considered completely appropriate in a democratic society for elected officials to actually make the decisions about how public servants will serve the public. That, I think, is the key insight that we often lose when we start talking about educational accountability. The essence of democratic politics is distrust. We love to talk in the schooling about communities of trust and stakeholder buy-in and all this stuff. Well, you can do that in communities of 500 or 2,500. You can do that between school leaders and teachers and parents because they actually know each other. When you are talking about boroughs, or you're talking about cities, you're talking about a nation of thousands or millions of people who don't know each other, and you are being asked as a policymaker to spend money or make rules, you cannot operate in an environment of trust. So you can't tell police that they can go ahead and use their judgment on who to stop and when to stop them and how to charge them. You can't tell the military, yeah, invade if you guys feel like invading. You don't tell doctors, yeah, charge Medicare if you think you should. What you do is you have to operate from the premise that for every 99 good apples, there's a bad apple, and your butt's going to be in a sling if you wind up getting accused of having allowed the bad apples to go out their business. So you write rules and regulations and build accountability to police against bad apples. That's what policy is. And there are only 3 ways in the whole world to actually try to work that magic. One is input regulation, which we all despise. A second is consumer choice, which creates all kinds of complications and many concerns in terms of equity. And the third is coercive outcome accountability, where you tell people, we're not going to tell you how to do it, and we're not going to just say people can pick whatever they want to pick, but you can go about your business so long as you succeed according to our measures. Well, that was the reinventing government mantra by Osborne and Gabler 20-odd years ago. That was, as Joel pointed out, kind of, what underlay the standards movement in important ways. And that was, in theory, kind of the NCOB mantra, except they forgot the whole let you do what you want half of it. That's a different story. But look, that's the underlying trust. So we have these bizarre conversations in education. We say, look, we're for testing as long as it is formative, so long as it's actually to promote learning. We're not crazy about it in terms of accountability or coercion. Well, I'll tell you what, policymakers give 2 hoots about our notions of formative improvement. That's not their job. They're like, look, you educators, formative your butts off. We don't care. We are spending billions of public funds. We are entrusting millions of students to your care. We are worried about gross inequities in terms of life circumstances. So we don't care how you go about the formative stuff. We just want to know that our money is well spent. And that is the underlying logic. So what happens is when policymakers are talking to educators, it's hugely and often a case of folks talking past each other. All right, 2 other points let me make. One, this is where, our friend, the Secretary of Education's comment was so bizarrely unproductive about white suburban moms. One, he's just wrong. Only 2 states have actually really changed their assessments yet, Kentucky and New York. So the vast majority of pushback is not about people worrying about the way their kids are being affected. It's because people have lots of concerns with what's getting roped into this apparatus of Common Core. The second is that it's bizarre because I know for a fact that the Secretary and many other friends who were in favor of the Common Core were saying, 11, 12 months ago, because I wrote about it at the time, that they couldn't wait until middle-class suburbanites got the wake-up call of Common Core assessments, because they would see they had been lied to, and they would suddenly have the scales fall from their eyes. And they would understand that they needed to support the agenda of change. Now, this was striking to me, and I wrote about it 12 months ago, because I had the same freaking conversations 11 and 12 years ago when my friends in the Bush administration told me that the NCLB was going to cause the scales to fall from people's eyes. And I was dubious then, and I'm dubious now. Now, final point, let me just say that to the extent the educators are frustrated about the fact that both NCLB and Common Core have felt imposed upon them, that they feel unvalued by the accountability metrics, that they feel like their voices aren't being heard, is I am sick of the whining. I think they have nobody to blame but themselves. Because if you go back to '94 and the Clinton administration, when the Clinton administration, a Democratic administration with a Democratic Congress, proposed a radical and malignant step of testing once in elementary school in reading and math, once in middle school, and once in high school with no consequences, educators and education professors showed up in mass to tell the policymakers what doinks they were, how completely they failed to understand the important and passionate work of education. So you wound up getting the Improving America's Schools Act, where states got free money to do voluntary report cards for 7 years, took the money, took the millions. 7 years later, barely a quarter of states had bothered to do even voluntary, toothless report cards. And so what happened was folks like George Miller and Ted Kennedy and George Bush said, look, we don't trust you guys to clean up your house. And thus, we've written the story the last decade. So if educators really want to talk differently about how tests will be used and regarded, I think they need to start by stepping up in the way Jal talked about and offering what are alternative ways that policymakers and the public can feel confident that kids and college students and pre-K kids are being well served.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for being so sort of wishy-washy, Rick.
That's what I'm here for.
At some point, we need to have an argument about bad apples regulation. I think there are other policy instruments like capacity building and incentives, which needn't fall into the bad apple only trap. But I have a question to start with. How important is the quality of the test itself? I mean, listening to you, I think Jeff would say no. Lynn would say very important. Kevin would say probably important because the placement test wasn't great. I think Jal would say no, and I couldn't tell what you would say. So how are my predictions, and does it matter? I mean, because we spent the morning talking about potentially better tests. And is it, if you put it into the same regime, is it going to not matter? Yeah. You don't have to answer in order.
Okay. Well, we should break out of that soon. But
Yeah.
so I think the quality of tests matters for a lot of things, but not for the political dynamics that we're talking about today. I mean, the political dynamics, I think, are more about the fact that there actually are competing visions of what we want education to do. We don't have a consensus, although we like to pretend that we know what a good education system is, and we're just talking about means to it. And as a result, we treat politics as an interruption when really it's the mechanism we have for adjudicating differences of competing visions. And I think it doesn't matter because, as Jal and Rick, in particular, have highlighted that and as came out this morning, is the key decisions in terms of driving policy aren't being made inside the education community. They're being made by policymakers, to some extent by private organizations that are investing in and anticipating where this is going, and to some extent by other groups, parents and others who have concerns but don't have a unified voice in this. So I think that the debates are about conflicting values, the debates are about conflicting visions, and one other point, and then I'll stop. And this is happening in the U.S., which is by design a highly decentralized system historically, and a highly fragmented system. So options that were discussed this morning about other countries aren't there. There was great emphasis put this morning on the importance of context and application in terms of testing. And we have a system where there are many, many contexts. And so even if you take the same instrument and put it out there and let it run, we're going to get a lot of different results. So people are responding both on the basis of conflicting values and different contexts where policies play out differently.
Anybody else on the?
One kind of qualification, maybe even a pushback, is I think the quality of the test matters in one sense, that at least since '01, we've been talking about tests of basic numeracy and literacy, very much designed about kind of this achievement gap agenda. By definition, these are going to piss off suburban and middle-class families because schools are going to focus on what is being tested, and what is being tested is simply not top of the mind in terms of the primary concerns for these middle-class and suburban families. So if you actually get assessments which are more robust, which actually tap into the things that they care about, I think they're going to be less concerned that schools are being dragged away from the ability to develop and cultivate their kids' gifts. I think in terms of what Kevin touched upon, we're going to see exactly this in higher ed, that coming out of the gainful employment conversation, what the president has instructed the Department of Education to build is very much a vocational ed mindset of higher ed accountability. And I think for the 300, 400 selective higher ed institutions, which actually tend to drive much of kind of the coastal higher ed conversation, what we're going to see drafted and released is going to feel profoundly inappropriate.
Yep. And I might add, teachers are another constituency. Right now, teachers are split. There's a what I think is a relatively small number of very vocal teachers who are really unhappy with the coming of sort of yet another round of wave of tests. And then there's a sort of substantial group, which I think for the moment is the larger group, that is seeing Common Core as a chance to move away from everything a mile wide and inch deep, and that this might finally be a chance to do some things in more depth. So if those assessments come out and they don't reflect those priorities, the teachers and their unions are going to turn on the policy. So that's another group that it's going to matter. And I agree with what Rick says about universities. As we all know, professors are very sensitive to exactly how things are measured and what the purposes are that lie beneath them and whether they match their own purposes. So the content matters there too.
Kevin?
You know, I think what we're struggling with is how to think about if higher education has not responded well, is to think about why. And I think it's a lot of it could be simply the academy defending its cartel-like or, you know, narrowly professional interests, but I think also other complicated things are involved. I keep thinking, for example, a lot of higher educators have resisted, haven't fought, but resisted performance funding because they've seen it sometimes sweep in very poorly thought out, sudden forms. My favorite example is South Carolina deciding all in a year to move its entire system to 100% performance funding. And they developed the measures in consultation with the business community, with the educators in the room but not allowed to speak. They had to put their hands up and be recognized. And out of this, they hammered 37 measures that would drive 100% of the funding, and the thing crashed and burned in 3 years. So there's a lot of fear of these sudden spasms of state elected officials' decision-making that I think they're fearful. There's also, I think, evidence of where the academy has tried to respond. I mean, certainly a lot of what's going on with placement testing as community colleges and other institutions are really trying to figure out what will work and do a more effective job of placement testing. So I think there's also evidence in effect of higher education institutions responding. But to the degree it's still not enough, and I'm still trying to ponder what Rick said because I think it's something really to think about, is I think to go back to your point, Susan, is the issue of capacity building. I think what makes it very difficult for educators to do what Chow's calling for, which I think is very attractive, and we need to think about it, is that, for one, at least in higher education, we're talking about an extraordinarily fragmented higher education community, broken down by institution type and discipline. There's no overarching organization. The AUP can't even come close to that. What's the form in which you begin to adjudicate these really quite profound differences about how do you measure what higher education is supposed to do? Which is what we're getting at. And that would require, I think, very careful construction of fora for those kinds of discussions and the capacity building for the profession and the institution to be able to engage that conversation. I think it'd be very useful to think about, you know, if you're thinking almost like in an advocacy coalition framework perspective, how do you construct fora to work out these very difficult differences of perspective? And there's some leads we have on what it takes, but I've seen very little discussion among policymakers about building that kind of situation.
Sometimes universities have to step in. Lynn, you were going to say something about
Just a quickie.
test quality.
Yeah, just a quickie. Like higher ed, early childhood is so ridiculously fragmented that the implementation of anything we're talking about is highly questionable. But I look at it as kind of a scale, that if you don't have a quality instrument, and the big question is, what is that quality instrument? Because we all might disagree. I might say I want a comprehensive instrument that looks at all domains of development. You may say we want an in-depth instrument that only looks at ELA and math. But it seems to me that if you don't have a quality instrument, by whatever definition of quality you're using, that it is really immoral to use it on children and for the purposes for which this nation is calling its use.
So picking up on something some of you have alluded to, states are very different across these sectors. So every day when I wake up and I get depressed about New York, I try to read about California because the Common Core is really playing out differently in California. So would you reflect on that, what you've seen across the states? And maybe the factors that are affecting state differences?
Joe?
Thanks, Rick. For those of you who've never had the pleasure of being on a panel with Rick, I really invite you to try it sometime. Well, I mean, in this sense, it is a little like healthcare, in that states vary greatly in the degree of enthusiasm, particularly once you get, it's not like healthcare in that, at least for now, there's more support at the governor's level. But if you get below that, the amount of money that's being put into capacity building, teacher professional development, varies widely. As I imagine almost everybody in this room knows, Georgia decided to pull out because they thought that the assessments were going to be too expensive. So there's quite considerable variation that sort of runs along the lines of the kind of accountability regime framework Jeff laid out. That there are some states which have sort of tried to build up that sort of middle of stuff that you're going to need to make it work, and other states for financial or political reasons have not. And we're going to see that play out over the next few years.
I think you can find some very interesting differences among states, and you can't quite reduce it to state political culture. It's almost like state working style of governance, and it's hard to get at what that sometimes involves, not just legislative professionalism, it's not just gubernatorial powers. But what we've been struck in our research is looking at a state like Tennessee, which has one of the better known and better regarded performance funding systems, and not without its, problems. But the way they went at it was over a long period of time, of a lot of consultation with institutions. It's clear you have a whole cadre of government officials, both elected and part of the civil service, that have been at this for a long time. I mean, it's almost like you're sitting in, I don't know, the British or Scandinavian civil service, heaven, of long-term, careful consultation. And yet you see other states that don't go at that. Florida tends to have much more
Term
rapid
limits?
alternation.
Term limits difference, or
Well, that's an interesting point. Yeah, let me think about whether that comes in, because that, I think, probably plays a key role. Part of it, though, is also, I think, the relationship, maybe term limits affects the relationship between the legislature and the bureaucracy and how they, in effect, allow for each other to play an important role. So, yeah, term limits may be an important part of that.
Lynn?
I was just going to say, I think it's part of the bigger question. This country was founded on states having a great deal of independence and responsibility for education. We all know that. But the reality is, the current governmental apparatus is moving toward less specialized attention to states and much more aggregation of policies. So we see two consortiums around testing. In early childhood, we see two consortiums that by definition are going to band states together to act much more alike than different. So this notion of the 50 states being laboratories for innovation on this or any other topic, I think is really giving way to much more federal input and control.
Well, one real difference among states are those who got Race to the Top and those who didn't, and those who got No Child Left Behind waivers and those who didn't, although there are fewer. But when one talks about the developmental rush that's going on, that we talked a lot about at the earlier session, and the crunch of getting the test developed and the implementation and nothing working, all you had to do was go back to the stimulus money. It had to be spent by September of 13. And so if you didn't get Race for the Top, or you weren't getting a No Child Left Behind waiver, I think you had more flexibility, right? I didn't mean this to be a speech, meant to be a question.
That's right. That's why people are opting out.
Right.
Well, I mean, in light of, one of the things that's come up that Jeff talked about
Yeah.
was, and I think that Giles said really clearly, is a lot of the back and forth over the testing is not really about the testing, but it's all the stuff that the testing is hooked up to.
Yeah.
Kind of like a battery.
Accountability. Yeah.
And the real question is, what's the vehicle that the battery's powering? And because, going back to '09, when the folks, when John Schnur was pushing for a Race to the Top, when so many of the domestic policy and the education team at the administration talked about a window of opportunity. They said, look, we've got the stimulus here, we've just come in with, we need to take advantage of this window of opportunity. And states, as we know, were desperate for cash and weren't necessarily thinking all that clearly about 3-4 years downstream. And so what happened was a lot of commitments got made, linking a lot of stuff together. And this is, I think, one of the complicating points, for instance, about the Common Core discussion, is advocates say, whoa, Common Core is not part of this other stuff. But the fact is that it was all kind of encouraged by the same pursuit of Race to the Top money. Right. It's all been encouraged, bundled together by the Secretary in the waiver process.
Exactly right.
When I was on the stage in Chicago a month or two back with Secretary Duncan, he kept saying, Race to the Common Core will only work if we get teacher preparation and instructional material, and the rest right, which very clearly suggests these things are bundled. And so what you now have in the public mind as it discusses the testing is not the couple hundred pages of standards in cyberspace, and not saying, hey, let's actually see what the question design looks like that emerges from Park and SBAC. What they're saying is, as Common Core to them, is this whole cluster of stuff that got pushed to Race to the Top and waivers, and there is lots of, in addition to the fact that you were naturally going to see lots of discomfort, particularly in suburban communities among teachers, as this stuff has teeth, on the teacher evaluation and the SIG and the rest, you have also put yourself in a point where it is almost impossible to see this being implemented really well in many places because they are implementing it in a rush, a lot of it at once. They have to put in place the scaffolding and the infrastructure even before the test items, which are going to drive it, are even clear. And as problems emerge with the IT infrastructure for Common Core assessment, as the early bumps come out in terms of grading or evaluation or validity and reliability questions, all of this is going to choke the whole system rather than simply be played out as a psychometric experiment. And in that sense, I mean, I think Race to the Top and the waivers wound up forcing this to happen on a timeline and in a fashion and on a scale which I think well-intentioned advocates are very likely to ultimately regret.
I agree. So I hear somebody from the audience wants to get into it.
Oh, sure, I'm sorry, absolutely. Oh, I just think that the scale at which this process had led these things to be pursued, the timeline, and the intertwining nature is something that the advocates thought was a brilliant strategic ploy when you talked to them in '09 and in '10. I think ultimately in 2016, 2017, they're going to conclude that it was a mistake. Oh, I think they're going to conclude in 2016, 2017 that it was a mistake.
Wait, we're not, we still have panelists who want to say a few things. Is that, okay?
Yeah, I just wanted to make one comment broadly, and it'll come around to the time issue and time pressure issue, but I also want to put it in a bigger context, which is we can talk about these things, and we have mostly talked about these things in terms of development within the education sphere. But in general, I think there's another factor that's going on here, and that is that education is being increasingly dealt with by general purpose bodies, groups like state legislatures, by Congress, by the president, by mayors.
Jeff, is there something people can read on this?
I'm not going to do that. I'm not.
Plug for Jeff's book.
Yeah. But very subtle. But that has consequences. I mean, that has consequences. It has consequences in terms of the trust issue that Jal talks about, which is these are not groups in many instances that have a historic trust in educational experts. Many legislators are elected for short periods of time. In a lot of states, they don't have deep staffs, so they really can't grapple with the issues in depth and complexity. Many are term limited, so you don't have the embedded knowledge over time and the time perspective. So I think some of the dynamics that we've been talking about are related to that, not just the mistrust of educators, but the focus on outcomes. We can measure outcomes. We don't get this black box stuff on the inside. And the time pressures, because, politicians are politicians, and, as democratically responsive actors, they're supposed to be paying attention to elections. Well, they are paying attention to elections, and so it's harder for them, not impossible, but harder for them to take into account a long-term incremental march strategy as opposed to looking for things that will generate returns that they can run on next time around. And all that finally is happening against the backdrop of broad national political dynamics that are raising the stakes around certain partisan battles and exacerbating that tension to take advantage of windows of opportunity. When you get a chance to get what you've done and nail it down, you better move and get it there, because there's a risk that the next time around someone's going to come into office and try to undo that.
So I just want to pick up on one point before I know Lynn wants to talk, but one of the things I'm curious about California and why it seems to be better, although this is a 3,000 miles away view, and asked Mike Kirst, who is Jerry Brown's right-hand person, my old colleague in CPRI, head of the state board. 3 things: end of term limits, nonpartisan redistricting, and a change in the primary system. It's a younger and more diverse electorate, and they are making themselves heard in California. So, interesting to think about. Lynn?
A high school science and math teacher, I have suffered through the last 2 years of the daily descriptions of the blows and the suffering from going through the test and teaching to the test. It has resulted in promotions and non-promotions for teachers. It has resulted in removal of principals because of how many people passed the test or didn't pass the test. Beloved assistant principals were reassigned. But most of all, the one thing you didn't talk about, after the tests were done, the local paper printed the results for all the schools in the county. There was an immediate impact on real estate values. Immediate impact in terms of could you sell your house because your school was now below everybody else's scores. So this had an immediate impact on the mayors, the city councils, to push the superintendents to improve those scores to maintain the real estate values. And there were calls for superintendents to be dismissed because of the impact on real estate values.
So this gets at the point that Rick made, the first point about democracy. All right, so let's talk about democracy. So part of the challenge with Common Core is if the assessments match the way that it's been described in the standards, they're asking for what really would be a sea change in many teachers' practice. We can say in a sentence that you're moving from procedural math to conceptual math. But think of what that means. It means that you came in with a textbook, you ran kids through some problems, you knew the answers to those problems because you'd read it before and you taught it before, and then you asked the kids to do it. And now, in a new world, you're supposed to essentially like pose them problems, help them work together to think about how one might think about solving the problem, which requires knowledge of math, knowledge of the sort of underlying concepts of math, and knowledge of how to teach in that way. All of which may be destabilizing to you because it may take your role as the sort of authority and expert in the classroom and move you to someone who could occasionally be wrong, who is in a position that you're essentially facilitating a fairly expert process. So if we want that kind of learning for teachers, they need time to unlearn what they know, and they need a lot of time to try things out with expert coaches, reinforcements, to try out things with other teachers, see what works, see what doesn't work. And so if we couple that with a time and political time where teacher evaluations are coming and your names are going to be published in the newspapers, and we don't have much in the way of available funding to support you in professional development, it's a really, really, really bad combination.
So, 3 points here. One, part of this is this whole question of how do you use this information, including the publishing of individual names in the papers. And the day after the LA Times came out with it a couple years ago, I wrote a piece which I thought it was asinine and destructive to do individual names. And it was funny, at the time I got a lot of grief from a lot of my friends in the reform community, but over time they then migrated to the same position. So I think one of the problems here is that we have a tendency to kind of celebrate these things before we think about them. So for what that's worth. Second thing is the gentleman's point about the property values is spot on. In fact, this goes back, there's political science research goes back about 20 years documenting this exact phenomenon. And one thing to keep in mind is only 22% of American households have school-aged children in the home. The majority of people voting in any state are, their immediate interest in schools is not as far as schools affect their kids, but as far as schools affect their lives through other people's kids, which means affects their property values, which is their biggest single investment, which means affects the health of their local economy and whether or not they're going to be able to, enjoy a decent standard of living. And so oftentimes when we try to talk about this, because we're in schools every day, I'm not, I'm in an office building, but educators who are in schools every day, they talk about it as if everybody else ought to see it through their lens. And part of living in democracy is that lots of people who are paying for services and being affected by them have a right to weigh in, and they may see things through a different lens. A third point, just because I think Jal just lays this out beautifully. In a conversation like this, I often find that, when people have heard David Coleman talk about the Common Core, fewer, clearer, higher, away from procedure towards conceptual, they go, how could anybody not be in love with this? And it's funny, I spend a lot of time talking to folks and, state legislators who are skeptical about this, and the thing that always comes to my mind is there are certain, for instance, college football offenses, which are just hailed as brilliant. How could anybody not be in favor of this, Well, it turns out that even when you have something that looks really good on the chalkboard, and when they come in and give you a really passionate speech about how this is going to work, if you've got a whole bunch of people who are used to doing it one way, even if it's not optimal, sometimes you actually wind up worse for wear by trying to shoot the moon on a big conceptually attractive strategy rather than just choke. And that's what a lot of folks hear when they hear the shift from procedural to conceptual. They say, well, so in order to do it well, you need PD, you need training, you need instructional materials, you need these things. Doesn't sound like you really trust any of them are going to be done well, so why the hell am I buying a pig in a poke?
One quick point, this link between property values and schools is one of the ways that K-12 is different from early childhood and higher ed by and large. Very short point, the link between schools and property values is based on reputation and not necessarily on actual quality of schools. And at least some of the ambivalence in the suburban community towards the new direction of education is uncertainty themselves as to whether the new regimes, particularly those that look at value added at the student level, will reinforce their valued reputations or undermine them. And that's, I think, the hidden subtext about the suburban moms quote.
You've been very patient.
Is this on? Yeah. I just wanted to add a perspective following up on a number of these comments. So I used to work in finance, and from within finance, the people who do policymaking in finance are idiots and don't know anything about finance, number one. Even someone like Barney Frank, who journalists view as like really knows his shit, if you'll excuse me, like smart people within finance think that he does not know what he's talking about. So I think that to some extent, it is just part of the imperfection of group decision making that the experts are always going to feel misunderstood and put upon and so forth. Mm-hmm. The other thing I would make as a point is that, so from an external perspective, it seems to me that the intelligence community seems to not be externally controlled as opposed to education, as opposed to finance. And when we let the experts in intelligence make the decisions, they often make decisions that we don't agree with. In other words, that from within a community, if everybody is sort of in the same mindset, you can actually end up very far in an extreme position. Like, for example, that you don't consider the possibility that someday your activities might be revealed and it might undermine the credibility of the entire US tech industry, for example. And similarly, some people think that the finance industry has not been sufficiently externally controlled. So my point is that, like, even though people within education are the experts, that doesn't always mean that they understand everyone else's perspective or that they even have all the wisdom that we need them to have.
That was really well said. So I would never claim that any group of people who claim to be expert in an arena should be left free, unchecked, to make the decisions that they think are right. That would be contrary to democratic principles, and it's also true. It reinforces groupthink, and whole communities can go down wrong roads for a long period of time. I do think, though, that if you look at other countries, the processes, like I'll just take Canada for one. If you look at what happened in Ontario between like 2003 and 2011 or so, like between 1999 and 2003, the Conservative government was running ads on TV that said, "Your teachers go home at 3:15. Why are they getting paid so much?" Literally. And they lost the election in a democratic process. And the next government came in and they said, look, if we're going to improve teaching and learning over a long period of time, we need to get a whole bunch of people to commit their sort of heart and soul to this work over many years. It's not just a one-time thing. We need to look at this as something which is sustainable for teachers as well as for students. And so they developed a collaborative process where they consulted with unions and subject matter associations and so forth. They signed a longer labor contract, so they stopped striking every year to sort of clear some of that out of the way. And they came up with some sort of things that were wins for both, like, they added an extra teacher to do data on like credit recovery, and the unions liked it because it added another job, and the policymakers liked it because it helped create an in-school strategy around dropout rates. So I think that these things need to be balanced. The internal and the external need to converse with each other in a democratic setting. But my concern is that in the U.S. we're out of balance.
I, like Sarah, have had a long career in finance also, and I do believe that the finance industry should be regulated a little bit more, not less. That being said, a lot of the support, I think Jal brought out when NCLB was enacted, people with a lot of the major interests were sort of marginalized or on the sideline, but the business community was very supportive. Absolutely. And I would posit that nobody in the business community would put forth an accountability, a teacher accountability regime that we have in education, and that none of the hedge fund and private equity firms and Wall Street firms could ever judge their traders and bankers, I was one, on a algorithmic testing scheme that they couldn't understand and couldn't calculate on a daily basis or a monthly basis if you're a banker, a daily basis if you're a trader, of how you're doing. So has anybody compared, how the business community does performance measurement, and why aren't we, I mean, there are good examples of performance measurement in the business community, counter what some people might think what happened in 2008 and 2009, but there is a country, and there's good performance measurement examples in the military. So why the hell do we have what we have in education?
I don't know the answer. I'm going to ask the panel, but I did want to say that we used to say that you shouldn't let the two people who understand the value-added formula fly on the same plane. But maybe one of you.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I've spent a lot of time over the last decade with U.S. Chamber of Commerce in particular, kind of talking about exactly this set of questions. And I think that the key thing to keep in mind is that there's really two things which are fundamentally driving this. One is it's hard, I think, for people in education to understand just how massively frustrated and distrusting a lot of business and civic leaders and policymakers are with the education community. During NCLB, during the entirety of the Clinton administration, during the Spellings Commission, educators were more than happy to explain all of the reasons that testing and accountability were bad ideas. From the perspective of business leaders, of policymakers, they wouldn't say a damn thing about what was a good, workable, viable alternative. So they would say, well, we need multi-method, we need sophisticated, we need to be appropriately sensitive to, and business would say, fine, because I was at a bunch of these kinds of luncheons and working groups, and they'd say, we're happy to carry an idea that has the imprimatur of educators behind it, because we agree that we don't know exactly what works here, so give us something workable and better. And educators would say, well, you want to use it for formative, you want to use it instructionally, and business would say, fine. How do we know when schools suck? How do we use this to pull the trigger? What do we do about it? It was, again, people talking at cross purposes. So I think one reason that you see business embracing policies for teacher evaluation, for accountability, for school improvement, that when you ask them, they agree aren't all that sophisticated. They're like, look, if somebody gave us something better, we'd be happy to be for it, but it's been close to 15 years and nobody's given us anything better. The second thing that's going on is it's the nature of the democratic challenge again. Whenever I talk to business groups about this, I say, look, one way we could think about employee evaluation is we could go out to California, we could visit with 20 of the most highly regarded firms in Silicon Valley, we could interview each of their HR directors, we could come up with unified best practices, we could fly to Sacramento, and we could ask the legislature to mandate these metrics and this accountability system for all employees at any new venture in California. Do you guys think that would be a good idea? And they say no. And you say why? And they go, well, because we're not all the same. Good practices in one environment aren't the same as good practice in another. The right metrics depend on the clients you're serving. But what happens is in education, as we are often, as folks who don't like accountability often talk about, it's a public good, or at least a publicly flavored good, spending the public's money to serve 50 million children who are not yours. And so there is a sense of group responsibility. So if we have to wind up coming up with systems, with some alternative, which is going to be broadly viable, you wind up, unfortunately, with least common denominator solutions, and that's where we are.
So you've been waiting over here for
I have
patiently.
been,
Yes.
and I've been disappointed not to hear more about the impact of this on children. And I'm specifically thinking of 3 areas that the narrowing of the curriculum has taken the life and the fun out of learning for a lot of kids. I'm in school 3 days a week, and I see this 3 days a week. Children are now feeling, particularly younger children, a sense of personal accountability for their teachers' low scores, and children, particularly our ESL and our special ed students, are now feeling a sense of absolute hopelessness based on the fact that they were struggling, but now with the, in New York State, the new generation of tests, virtual impossibility of their receiving a viable score. So we've spent the whole day, really, and I think not so much talking about the impact of these policies and procedures on the lived lives of a generation of children, and that's what troubles me the most about what's going on.
Well, I'll begin to take it. Nobody, I think, on this panel or in this entire conversation is denying the impact of this on kids. Indeed, that is what much of this debate is all about. Having said that, there is also often a presumption that simply because we are administering tests, that the entire curriculum will indeed change. Indeed, what you treasure what you measure, so there is an element of truth to that, but it doesn't have to be that way. Tests can be seen as a means to collect data that do not necessarily impact the entire modus operandi of teaching. That's where the point of accountability comes in. I think we've got much more problem in figuring out how we use tests and for what purposes than the focus on the tests and their impact themselves. Because you can have tests and still maintain a very, very rich curriculum. Many people have seen it, many people in this room have done it. The problem is that we're misusing, and it's in the use that we need to focus on. It's really Jeff's point.
You have to get up and line up or ask for a mic. Right here, Mike Rebel.
Okay. This has been a profoundly insightful, but also a profoundly pessimistic discussion this afternoon. And after spending the morning hearing the vision that came out of the Gordon Commission and everything that was possible, now everything seems impossible. But my question to you really is on a serious plane. Does anybody have any sense of a policy direction that can better align the realities of democratic accountability with the real needs of children and the school system?
You know, for me, the simple starting point is I think educators would find themselves with enormously more influence over the things where they have real expertise, which is the design of the metrics, which is how these metrics are used, with how these are particularly used when it comes to judging employees and the daily work, if they were more explicit about acknowledging the appropriateness and the right of policymakers wanting assurance that money's being well spent and kids are being well served. Because right now, I think too often the conversation between educators and the people who are responsible for the funds and for making policy starts with the educators at best grudgingly acknowledging that these other folks belong in the conversation. And I think that tends to set these things on an enormously unproductive trajectory.
My question is, and I'm a special educator, so I'm a little bit out of the loop on some of these things, but how are we ultimately going to correlate what these assessments are doing with, like, success in life? You know, what, do they go to college? Do they, you know, have successful careers? Obviously, like, there's certain limitations to actually taking data on this, but it just seems to me like in my line of work, I want to make sure what I'm teaching my kids is making them independent, you know, is maximizing their full potential, you know, is this useful to them? I'm just wondering, like, how do we make sure all these tests are, you know, going to down the line say, okay, that kindergartner went to college, you know, something like that.
I just want to take that and wrap it into Michael's question about pessimism or more optimism. So there is an optimistic story, both in reality and potentially. In reality, there has been a movement towards a broadening of thinking about testing towards beyond math and science to multiple arenas and to non-cognitive education and to long-term success in college. Even in New York City, you know, a deliberate effort to move towards college readiness, we've been developing under the pressure of this accountability regime, because this is what politicians want to pay for. We've been developing better data systems that actually make it possible to begin to look at kids as they move from early childhood into K-12 and into higher education. So there's potential there that there wasn't there for. The question is, are we, or in my mind, a question is, are we going to realize those potentials? My pessimism comes back for 1 second, which is, Common Core had the potential to actually be a very positive element of broadening the constituency for accountability by linking accountability to a richer, more multifaceted curriculum. It's unfortunate that the Common Core accelerated testing regime has come when it has and with the speed it has, because Common Core is absorbing a lot of the anger towards testing, and that's fracturing what I think could have been a helpful constituency.
Could I add a quick? Yes. It is really quite a shame when you think about it, that with the Common Core, we had the potential to really begin to address children and students' development in lots of other domains. That indeed, this is focused on these two, has done a tremendous disservice and has put us in this catch-22. I am very excited about the work that I see going on around executive functioning, that we have a whole body of literature and a whole set of metrics that are coming online about that. I'm very excited about the CASEL work on the development of social emotional standards that have been adopted K-12 in the state of Illinois. So that I do think that we've gotten caught in the bucket of only two domains that is really circumscribed and perhaps tended to narrow the curriculum. But that doesn't mean that the idea of common standards and the idea of appropriate tests is really all wrong.
Bob.
Thank you. Rick, you use the word whining. So when people use that word, I take that very personally because it's kind of a negative connotation of perhaps some healthy skepticism about the reforms that are being placed on the schools. So the other side of whining, or the other side of complaining about what's being brought to the schools today, is a strong sense of pride that many of us who work in the schools feel. And we also feel that over time, we have built excellent schools, and the characterization of the public schools is basically negative. So Mehta writes, he wrote an article a bunch of years ago in the Harvard Education Letter, and he came out in favor of changing the paradigm of school change from beginning with research and policy to beginning at the schoolhouse, and he called it school-based, practice-driven school reform. And as a longtime teacher and as a longtime school principal, I embrace that idea. And I embrace the idea not only because so many of us who work in the schools have a deep passion and a commitment to making our schools better and better and better, but we have this healthy skepticism about the reforms that are placed on us. And here's an example, and then I'll be quiet. In 1989, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics came out with their new standards. In 2000, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics came out with their new standards. In 2006, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics came out with their focal points, which is even more focused standards. And now in 2013-14, we have the Common Core Math Standards. Now, those of us who work in schools are informed by these documents. But honestly, none of those documents transform schools the way that some of the policy people think that they're going to transform schools, because it's way more complicated than that. So I want to say loud and clear that in this country, even though Arnie Duncan says to us that we're napping and letting all the other nations of the world pass us by, we are not napping in the schools. There are many great schools, and I would say the ethos in most schools, which, by the way, are controlled democratically by school boards and democratic systems like that, we feel tremendously accountable to our communities and to our students and to each other for creating great schools in this country. And our schools are way better. And the data, if you look deeply, says that they're way better than what they're portrayed. So I'm a whiner, but on the other side of whining is tremendous hard work and pride in building schools.
So
There's a couple things. So one, I use the word whining very intentionally. Remember, what I was talking about, so for instance, if folks are expressing reservations or concerns about a lot of, the improvement strategies the last 5 years, I don't regard that as whining if folks are offering alternatives. I think I think it's entirely appropriate to argue about whether test-based state accountability and teacher evaluation frameworks are actually all that constructive. I'm enormously open to that criticism. For me, the whining was really very specifically from, especially that period from 94 to 02, when relatively innocuous requests for transparency and testing were being made by folks who generally had been regarded as allies of the teachers community. And I thought, I think the teachers community and the education professoriate responded by whining. And I say very explicitly that they didn't offer viable alternatives. They didn't explain other ways to address these concerns. They just said that these were silly concerns from the people elected to spend the money and organize the schools. Now, are there fair kind of questions, the Berliner Bittel manufacturer crisis pushback? Sure, I wrote just this week about why I actually think the whole PISA triennial thing is kabuki theater. I don't think it is a fair or useful criticism. I think Arnie is absolutely out of line when so I'm very sympathetic to that. But I also don't actually agree with you on the notion that educators everywhere feel enormously accountable. I think some educators do and some don't. I would say the same thing about bankers or lawyers or pediatricians or anybody else. I think part of the challenge for policymakers is they're dealing with human nature. And there's 3.5 million classroom teachers in this country. And the job of a policymaker is not to worry about the ones who are kicking it, who are killing it. Their job is to worry about the ones who are serving kids who are coming out of 12 years of education massively behind the 8 ball. And I think, in my experience, educators have not often talked about accountability or evaluation or assessment in a way that offers a viable strategy for those policymakers responsible for the entirety of children in that community or that state to be confident that mediocrity is being dealt with and addressed. So, and this is where I feel, because the points you made, I'm enormously sympathetic to. And if those are embraced in a viable set of alternatives for policymakers to deal with their concerns, in ways that we can actually say, look, we hear you. When we say that all educators are passionate and accountable, look, we're not naive. We know we don't literally mean every educator. So here's how we can offer a workable solution for addressing what we're both concerned about. In my experience, when that stuff has been put forward, it tends to get taken up greedily by policymakers looking for workable solutions. But I see that stuff coming forward just far too rarely.
Okay, I have a real challenge here. So, Kevin, quick comment.
Just a quick question. Rick, why do you think educators have not picked up the ball then? Because, part of it is, I'm thinking, as a sociologist standing back, I'm saying, if we're seeing a repeated pattern, it's got to be then deeply inscribed in organizational and other routines and in systems of incentives. So what's accounting for that? And try to get at what might be their, maybe mistaken action, but nonetheless, what structure of motives, incentives, interests, and obstacles are we talking about?
Yeah, so I think there's three things. One, Lordy pointed this out 40 years ago. Look, educators are, it's Jal has written about this beautifully. Wrote about it beautifully. Was it earlier this year or last year at this point?
Earlier this year.
Earlier this year. In the allure of order. But Lordy pointed this out. Look, teachers have been treated as passive objects. If you read the most widely assigned books for new teachers, for instance, they're all survival guides. Teachers see themselves as in these classrooms being acted upon. And so it's hardly ridiculous that their response to this stuff is to feel disempowered and out of it and to lash out, and that creates a perverse cycle where policymakers then decide that groups like Save Our Schools or badass teachers have nothing constructive to add, so they don't invite them to the table, and it just feeds on itself. So that's one. A second thing is, is that there are no professional opportunities or incentives historically for teachers to actually be at that table. We all know this. When we talk to teacher ambassador programs, when we talk to teacher leaders, when we talk to, NSTOY, the National Network of State Teachers of the Year, It's only really been the last 5, 6 years that you've seen teacher voice organizations actually start to organize and create the connective tissue that puts these guys routinely in front of folks who they can actually engage with. Otherwise, it's a teacher doing a ceremonial visit during their Teacher of the Year stance, and that is no way to actually. And then third is I actually think preparation and professional support has miserably failed the profession on this count. That if you look at what gets taught in teacher preparation, if you look at the stuff of professional development, literally little or none of it actually does anything to help educators understand how do they engage, how do you speak to policymakers, how do you articulate these concerns. So I think what happens is teachers have very, very much been put out on a boat with no oars. Then we blame them for being on a boat with no oars. Then they feel frustrated and victimized and lash out. And at this point, we're decades downstream where it's going to be an enormous project to figure out how do you kind of regrow that tissue.
Thank you all. I appreciate it.